Good evening, Mr. Reela, honored guests, ladies, and obviously most importantly this evening, the old boys of Pretoria Boys High School. To the Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Orr, no need to apologize, young man. I was certainly aware of that brewing opportunity that took place. Any Solomon boy who's brave enough to brew pineapple beer is a friend of mine. Thank you very much for that flattering introduction. I see this evening there are not many old boys from the class of 1990 here, so hopefully most of you will believe everything that he said. I think before I start with my address, just a couple of formalities I would like to deal with, and the first one is just greetings from Hermanus. As you're aware, I'm principal at Hermanus High School at the moment, and when I arrived in Hermanus in 2014, there's an old boy who resides there, David Lepan, class of 1966 from Rissikhaus, and he thought it was fit to get the Pretoria High School old boys, past pupils together and introduce me to them. And subsequent to that, we have formed a small branch and an association down in Hermanus, and we meet regularly once a year, and we have about 30 members at the moment. Last year, we had a particularly warm evening when Mr. Schroeder joined us and Mr. Reela joined us. It was part of the evening that they'd spent in Cape Town, where they went down for the old boys dinner, and they came through and we had a wonderful evening at La Pintola restaurant, which is a very well-known restaurant in Hermanus, where Shane Savage, an old boy from 1989, is now the restaurateur and is very well known not only throughout the country, but also throughout the world. That was a very special occasion. So I certainly bring greetings from Hermanus and from the Old Boys Association in Hermanus. I can mention to you as well this evening, I think it's worth mentioning, is after we'd met, and I think on the second occasion that we met in 2015, Mr. Lepan asked me, he said, is there anything we can do as an association to assist at Hermanus High School? And at that stage, we were trying to get the past pupils more involved with the school. I think as all of you would know, there's no doubt that a large part of the success of Pretoria Boys High School is the involvement of the old boys, and Jason Weber once again alluded to that this evening. And we were trying to build that pride. We continue to try to build that pride in the school, and we tried to re-emphasize it. And one of the things that we suggested was producing an old boys tie, or I need to say a past pupils tie, or some kind of past pupil memorabilia for the pupils, bearing in mind that we've got boys and girls at the school. So that evening we made a decision that we would produce a old boys tie for the boys, and we would produce a scarf for the girls. We then went on a fundraising campaign amongst, at that stage, I think there were probably about 20 of us who were involved, Mr. Mayor. And between the 20-odd past pupils in Hermanus, we raised over 60,000 rand, the contributions that were made. And with that money, we then purchased enough ties and enough scarves for the matriculants of Hermanus High School for the next 3 years. At the end of this year, we'll be giving those scarves out. So it was a wonderful contribution from the old boys of this school towards Hermanus High School, and I can honestly say it has made a huge difference. But not only do I come bearing greetings, I also come bearing gifts. A person who's been very instrumental in getting the Old Boys Association down in Hermanus going is Mr. Ed Meyer. Ed Meyer is with us this evening, and he came up, I think, in support of me. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Meyer. I really appreciate that. And there was also some business that he could attend to while he was here. I'm going to ask Mr. Meyer to please come forward and just join me here at the podium for now. Mr. Meyer matriculated from the school in 1957, and as I've mentioned, he's been very involved together with David Lepan in getting the Old Boys Association going in Hermanus. The gift I come bearing, Mr. Lepan will pick up, is a lamp which I'm going to give to the school this evening, but it is certainly no ordinary lamp. The lamp was given to me, in fact, by Mr. David Lepan. And that lamp was produced for Mr. David Lepan by a gentleman also from the class of 1966, Alistair Brand. In 2016, and I'm assuming some of the gentlemen are sitting at the table on my left-hand side over there, in 2016, the class of 1966 had their 50-year reunion. They came back to the school, and on the walkabout around the school, I'm not sure if you recall it, Mr. Reela, because I'm sure you took them on that walkabout. On the walkabout around the school, they were going down Jacaranda Drive, and they came across a branch from one of the Jacaranda trees in Jacaranda Drive that had fallen into the road. Mr. Brand at that stage picked the draft up, or picked the branch up, and he put it on the side of the road. And at the end of the day, he went back and he collected it, placed it in his car, and took it home. And while he was at home, he is a wood turner by trade. He produced 4 of these lamps. So these are lamps which are made from jacaranda tree, which have been planted and grown on the grounds of Pretoria Boys High School. In a year or two, or I think it was in 2017, a year later, he came through to Hermanus, he visited Mr. Lepan, and he gave it to Mr. Lepan as a gift. Mr. Lepan ran for many years a very successful property business in Hermanus, and at the end of 2017, he retired, handing the business over to his son. And this lamp had stood in his office for the year, and he felt it was appropriate to come and give it to me. He arrived at my office one day at the school, and he said, "Greg, I'd like to hand this lamp to you," and he explained the history to me, and he said, "I think that this lamp should sit in your office at Hermanus High School." In the discussion that we had earlier this year when we were arranging our lunch for the 12th of July, which will take place, we made the suggestion that as opposed to that lamp sitting in Hermanus High School's principal's office for however many years in the future, maybe a more appropriate place for us was at Pretoria Boys High School. Mr. May, Mr. Lepan, and I agreed that I would bring the lamp up this evening and we would hand it over to the school. So this evening, Mr. Rila, I'd like you to come forward, please, and accept this gift from the Overberg branch of Old Boys in Hermanus. Right here. I left the lampshade in Hermanus for obvious reasons. I'm sure that you will find an appropriate one, and I'm sure that you'll find an appropriate place for the lamp in the school where it deserves and should be. Thank you. I've just been informed that Alistair Brand is in fact here with us this evening. Where's the gentleman? If you'd stand up, please, sir, so we can see the remarkable hands that made this lamp. Let's give him a warm round of applause. When Mr. Mayer approached me a couple of months ago to speak at this dinner, I must admit that I was, number one, taken aback, and secondly, when I had the chance to think about it, very reluctant to accept the invitation. In thinking about it, I certainly felt, and I continue to believe, that there are far more appropriate and significant old boys of this school who should be doing the address at the 100th Old Boys Dinner. I explained to Mr. Mayer in that telephone call after receiving the invitation that I'm certainly not a particular, or not particularly articulate. I'm not a great orator. I am not a past international sports captain. I'm not a world-renowned entrepreneur or a constitutional judge. At the moment, I'm a budding headmaster trying to do the best I can with a school that we're trying to grow in Hermanus. In fact, I did everything in my power to try and convince Mr. Mayer that I was not the appropriate person to speak this evening. And unfortunately, he was having none of it. And so you find me doing the guest address this evening. I've got to say, Mr. Mayer, in hindsight, while I was very reluctant to accept the position, having had the opportunity to come up this weekend to spend the day at the school, I need to pay a compliment to you, Mr. Rila. It's been wonderful for me, for the first time in 5.5 years, to come back to Pretoria Boys High School and to see this wonderful institution. I think your grounds are looking immaculate. I think your buildings are immaculate. This hall is world-class and something to behold. I thoroughly enjoyed watching hockey, rugby this morning, intermingling with the boys. And I've got to say, I've been exceptionally impressed. Probably not that I expected anything otherwise, but I think you and your staff need a huge compliment for that. Well done, and thank you. Thinking about this evening, I very quickly realized that I would have to remain true to myself and that I would not be able to prepare anything particularly profound. And for that reason, I've not so much prepared a speech, but rather a story which I'd like to share with you this evening. Well, this is my story. I hope that it relates to every single one of you who are sitting in this dining hall this evening. And I hope that it relates to just about every single old boy who has come from this school in the past 100 years. Perhaps even more importantly, I hope that my story continues to have relevance to every single old boy that this school will continue to produce over the next 100 years. If I was to give my story a name, I would call it The Unsuspecting Headmaster. What makes my story perhaps different to most of yours is the fact that not only did I have the privilege of attending this school, but I also had the privilege of teaching here for a period of 14 years. My story begins in 1982. My brother and I were living in Johannesburg. We were being raised by a single mom who was working hard, and under the circumstances, thought that it was best to send my brother to boarding school. My brother arrived at PBHS in 1982, and so my association also began with the school. My very first memory of the school is as a young Standard 2 boy, was attending an inter-house athletics meeting. I remember seeing the school buildings for the first time, and even more so, I remember being down at the athletics track. I remember the tartan run-up to the long jump pit and feeling that I'd arrived at an Olympic stadium rather than an inter-schools athletics meeting. And so for the next 4 years, went by with me coming and going before I arrived as a boarder in Solomon House in 1986. My brother had already been here for 4 years, and I think at that stage, Mr. Armstrong had already on a number of occasions seriously regretted ever having accepted him. His friends chuckle knowingly. Based on my brother's performance, I've no doubt that Mr. Armstrong was rather reluctant in accepting me, and probably did so with some trepidation. Unfortunately, I would have to say that I probably lived up to these expectations. Let's just say that having been brought up in Johannesburg by a single mom who was working hard, as a primary school pupil, I had a lot of time on my hands. In that time, I would say that I became pretty streetwise, and I brought a lot of that wisdom with me to Pretoria Boys High School. I have no doubt that some of my classmates who are here this evening, or my dorm mates who are here this evening, would agree with me. Under the circumstances, let's just say that in those first 2 years, things did not probably go all that well for me. I got involved with the wrong crowd, and I continued with many of my antics learnt in Johannesburg. During my time as a teacher at Boys High, I obviously had many occasions to visit the headmaster's office. I have to say, however, that during those first 2 years as a pupil, I was probably in and out of the office on more occasions than I ever was as a teacher. If one looks back, and I think about my Solomon House dorm mates from 1986, I think we could have predicted the career path that a number of them would have followed. If I think about Sean Emery, who's here this evening, he was always going to become a seriously successful entrepreneur and businessman. Nigel Hopkins, who was also here this evening, was always going to become a captain and very senior pilot at SAA and a world champion aerobatics pilot. If I think about Michael Sanderson, he was always going to become a very, very successful banker on the International Stock Exchange. Paul Schoenfeld was always going to become a pastor, and so the list goes on. The one person we probably didn't predict was Brett Lads becoming the personal chef of Mr. Nelson Mandela in 1984, shortly after he was elected to the president's office. What we certainly didn't predict was in 1986 was that Greg Hassenkamp would become the headmaster of a school somewhere. In fact, it probably would have been laughable. If we'd been betting boys in those days and we'd placed a good 10 rand on me becoming a headmaster, a couple of us would be seriously wealthy by now. If the truth be told, I continue to believe that had I not attended this school and had I not landed up, or if I had landed up going to my local high school, obviously I would not be here this evening, but I also fear to think where I might be, or even perhaps might not have been. But over time, and during those first 2 years, PBHS and Solomon House were able to take hold of me. The influence of those people who were in my dormitory, the friends I started to realign myself with, and very importantly, the many schoolmasters who crossed my path, were unbeknown to me, slowly making their impact. By the time Form 3 came around, a number of things had started to fall into place. I can't say that I was working particularly hard, although I think my marks had improved, and I was playing a whole lot more sport and getting into a whole lot less trouble. I remember in 1998 being in the school swimming team being coached by Mr. Paul Anthony. I was in the 6th rugby team being coached by Mr. Eddie Dory. I was in Solomon House and had housemasters the likes of Mr. Alwyn van den Aardweg, Alan O'Brien, and John Yelsley, all people who in their own special way made an impact. When I speak about their own special way, I'm not only speaking about Mr. Dory's legendary rugby practices or Mr. Anthony's unique ability to motivate and get the best out of pupils. But in the good old 80s, one of those forms of encouragement was the ever-present cut-off hose pipe, the infamous cane or the leather strap that was found in many of the offices of the PT teachers. A few such teachers who come to mind, who had in fact had a significant influence on my education, are Mr. Tully van Aswegen, Eddie Dory, and the infamous elbow of Mr. Alwyn van den Aardweg. On one such occasion, I remember having to visit Mr. van den Aardweg's office in Solomon House after the staff at Pretoria Girls High School had foolishly invited the Form 3 boarders for a social evening at that school. I need to give you a bit of background to that evening. At that stage, there was a trend in the school whereby the boys were having chalk fights. And what we mean by chalk fights was during the first 3 periods of the day, you would accumulate as much chalk as you could from the teachers' classrooms. You'd take that chalk and you'd break it into small pieces of about 1 centimeter long. And the boarders, after getting your sandwiches at the boarding house, would then rush up to the koppie where you would have a chalk fight. And that chalk fight would involve wedging that small piece of chalk in between your fingers and then catapulting it as hard as you could at one another. If I remember correctly, Hyde or Honeyball was the champion chalk flinger, and if you got drilled by a piece of chalk by Hyde or Honeyball, you would be in serious pain. The evening that we were invited to Pretoria Girls High School, we walked in there and the cool guys remained cool and they went off and spoke to all of the girls, and the uncool guys almost stood in a corner and didn't know what to do with themselves. At that stage, we noticed the peanuts that had been left on the table. The problem with the peanuts was they were just about the exact same size as a piece of chalk if you broke it down to a 1 centimeter piece. And so the odd peanut started flinging itself around the room at Pretoria Girls High School. It was quite fun for a while, and the novelty wore off until a Pretoria Girls High School girl got hit by a peanut. It tended to make a different sound, and the reaction from the girls was vastly different to the reaction from the boys. Needless to say, the boarders on that evening quite enjoyed it. Another incident that evening that comes to mind was a young man by the name of Ian Murray. He was a schoolhouse boarder. And the other mistake that they made that evening was to place fruit on the tables. And one of the fruits they placed on the table was bananas. And Ian Murray, during the course of the evening, decided he would eat as many bananas as he could and get as many into his mouth in one occasion as he could. He took it one step further and he went outside and he positioned himself outside one of the windows. And every time a girl's eye girl inside the room walked past, he'd knock on the window. When they stopped to look at him, he'd puff his cheeks up and gently squeeze out the smooth banana paste which was in his mouth. It looked very similar to a pimple being squeezed. Needless to say, the reaction was exactly what we were expecting, and the uncool boys found the evening tremendously entertaining. For some reason, Clive Blooming and I were singled out on that particular evening, and that's the reason we arrived in Mr. van den Aardweg's office when we got back to the school. He gave us the necessary punishment, but over and above the caning that we received, we were exceptionally upset about the fact that on that Friday evening we were not allowed to go to the Glen to watch their production of Grease, because he felt our behavior in front of girls was certainly unbecoming. But despite the small mishaps I continued to have along the way, coming out of a home where I'd never had any major male role model to make an impact on my life, this predominantly male environment proved to be just what I needed. In fact, it had such a big impact on me that by the time I finished school, I decided to study teaching. There is no doubt the fact that I wanted to study teaching was as a direct impact of the people and the place I'd been associated with for the previous 5 years. After studying, I taught in London for a couple of years, after which I took a post, as James mentioned this evening, at a small Catholic school in Johannesburg. In 1998, in true Mr. Schroeder style, I bumped into him at a St. Stithians rugby festival. He pulled me aside and he said to me, "Hazenkamp, when are you going to come teach at a decent school?" And in 1999, I arrived as a teacher in Pretoria Boys High School. After 4 years and still a relatively young and inexperienced schoolmaster, Mr. Schroeder had the faith in me to appoint me as the senior housemaster of Solomon House. Needless to say, being a past boarder and pupil in the house certainly prepares one for the job better than any training you're ever going to do. Moving into Solomon House in 1983, in 2003, I started to have all these flashbacks. And unpacking our furniture in the senior housemaster's house, and in particular unpacking my toiletries in the bathroom, I had one particularly revealing flashback. I looked up into the roof of the bathroom, directly above the bath, and I noticed a couple of strategically placed holes which had been there since 1990. As many of you would know, one of the privileges of being in Solomon House is when you're in matric, you get access to the roof. Back in the day, Mr. Orr, we used to make our beer in the roof, not in bags, and that was your first mistake. So when 1990 arrived, we thought it was only right to make use of this privilege. In 1998, Mr. van den Aardweg had arrived, and with him he brought an extremely attractive house lady. In 1990, we took advantage of this. We went into the roof. There were recently developed headlamps, which you all use today when we go camping, and we navigated our way through this roof. We worked our way to the far bottom corner. We worked out where the bathroom was. We finally found out where the bath was, and so we injected a couple of strategically placed holes directly above the bath. Needless to say, when I moved into Solomon House in 2003, we put a serious dose of paint on that roof, and I went up and plugged a number of holes. The only thing I didn't do was put down razor wire in the roof, which I seriously considered at the time. Another lesson I learned when going back to Solomon House in 2003 is the more things change, the more they stay the same. On one particular evening in 2004, and I'm not sure if there are any old boys here from 2004 Solomon House. It's probably safer that they left me alone this evening. Anyone would know from being in a boarding house, and Mr. Yelsley, Mr. O'Brien would attest to this, possibly the worst night you can be on duty in a boarding house is the last matric evening of the year, because it's generally chaos. So I called the matrics in from 2004 and I said, listen boys, this evening there will be no chaos. Tomorrow is the final assembly. If you guys are going to stuff around, if you're going to bunk out, if you're going to throw water, you're not going to final assembly. I'm going to remove you from the boarding house tonight. You're going home, and in fact, you're not coming back. And I thought they'd listened, and I thought that everything was under control. Needless to say, I couldn't have been more wrong. So chaos proceeded to break out during the course of the evening, and we tried to put out the fires. I think at around 11 or 12 o'clock, I decided we'd had enough. I sent everyone to bed. I decided I would sleep in the foyer. I took a walk through Solomon House yesterday with Sean Emery, and I see my bench in the foyer is still there. I brought a pillow, I put a blanket down, and I lay down gently in the foyer on my back, positioned myself strategically, and gently fell asleep. About an hour or two later, I heard the tinkling of the lock on the gate to the back passage of Solomon House. I got up, went around the corner, and there were 4 or 5 Solomon House boys coming in. Joska Zaleski, some of you would remember, who was a huge slab of flesh at the time, was leading the pack. And I said to him, yes, you know what, guys? I asked you so nicely. I told you what the consequences would be. I asked you not to bunk out, and now you've gone and done it. They said, no, sir, we didn't bunk out, I promise you. I said, well, what would you do? What would you have done if you were coming in at 2 in the morning? No, sir, we didn't bunk out. I said, well, where were you? No, sir, we went down to the pool for a swim. You've got no towels on you. You've got no costumes on you. You didn't go for a swim. No, sir, we skinny dipped. I said, Zaleski, your hair's not even wet. I said, that's it. You guys are going. He said, sir, can I tell you where we were? I said, Zaleski, I'd love for you to tell me where you were. He said, you won't believe where we were. We went up, we went to the hall, we went into the roof of the hall, and we went up there to write our names in the roof. I said, Zaleski, we told you boys, there's no more going into the hall writing your names. There's no more going to the bell tower and writing your names. It's over. So I was about to do my thing and read the right act, and he said to me, but sir, you won't believe what happened. And I said to him, Zaleski, you're probably right. I won't believe what happened. He said, you know what, sir? Do you know where I wrote my name? Directly below yours. Needless to say, no comeback. I asked him to go to bed quietly. He slept the rest of the night in the foyer, and we had a decent final assembly the next day. In 2005, Mr. Schroeder once again took a leap of faith and appointed me as deputy headmaster of the school. This allowed me to work closely with him and the rest of the school senior management team, once again gaining invaluable experience. It also allowed me to work closely with Mr. Ilsley, who acted as headmaster in 2010, and then obviously with Mr. Reeler from 2010 until my departure in 2013. All brilliant, yet very different leaders, each with their own style and each with their own strength, and all leaders from whom I've been able to take various aspects and apply to my own leadership style as I continue the road of trying to be a headmaster. All leaders who've influenced me in one way or another and who continue to play a role. So not only did this school raise me as a schoolboy, but just as importantly, it also molded me as a professional, as a manager, and as a leader. To say that PBHS is part of my DNA is probably not too far from the truth. There's no doubt that this school and its many influences have more than any other single influence in my life determined the person who I am today. When I talk about the DNA, it's interesting to think about my own son, who spent 6 years at the school. He was born in 2006 while I was living in Solomon House, and then we departed at the end of 2013. During the time that I've been in Hermanus, I've had very little contact with the school, but I haven't had to make contact because anything I want to know about the school, I hear from my son. I'll often walk past his room and hear the chant of all we see is red and green, red and green, red and green, as he's on the Boys Eye website watching videos of head boys and other motivational aspects. If I ever wanted to know a score of a rugby team or a hockey team, he would be the one to tell me. In fact, when I was getting on the plane yesterday morning, my wife sent me a WhatsApp and a photograph of my son dressed in his school uniform about to leave for school, but wearing my Pretoria Boys High School tie in his Hermanus Primary School uniform. Needless to say, we've had a couple of interesting discussions during the course of this year. He keeps telling me, Dad, but you always told me Pretoria Boys High School was the best school in the world. Why will you not send me there? He doesn't understand that 1,400 kilometers is quite far away. But I've got an aunt and uncle in Pretoria, I can stay with them. So we've had a couple of interesting discussions, and then there are now two best schools in the world. Pretoria Boys High School is the best all-boys school in the world, and Hermanus High School is the best co-ed school in the world. So that is my story. From my story, it's obvious that this school forms an undeniable part of who I am, and no doubt many of you feel the same way too. Maybe not to the extent that this school has influenced my life, but in one way or another, I'm sure that this school has influenced yours. Make no mistake, many people are invited to this old boys dinner, tonight and each year. Some do not attend due to circumstance. Some choose not to attend because this school simply does not mean to them what it does to you and to me. The school is not going to mean something to everyone, and we accept that. But the fact of the matter is that this school does mean something to you. If not, you would not be here this evening. I've mentioned my friends from the class of 1990. I've mentioned the likes of Paul Anthony, Eddie Dorey, Alwyn van den Aardweg, Alan O'Brien, John Ilsley, Bill Schroeder, and Tony Reeler. These are the people who have influenced my life. You will each have your own list. For this evening, in preparing for this address, many of you may have felt that I should have placed a bigger emphasis on the fact that this is the 100th Old Boys Dinner. Perhaps some of you feel that I should have even researched the 100th dinner, and I should have researched successful Old Boys and significant masters in order to reflect on the impact that they've had on the school over the years. Through my experience of this school as both a schoolboy and a master, I, however, feel somewhat different. I do not feel that this evening is about celebrating the success of those whom, for whatever reason, tend to stand out, the so-called legends of this school. This evening, I could quite easily have reflected on some of those legends, the Willie Brookses, the Charlie and Terence Mulvenas, the Bob Fairs, Tim Hills, John O'Healy's, Paul Somervilles, Will Hofmeyer's, Desmond Abernethy's, Malcolm Armstrong. The list goes on. But just as importantly this evening, then I would have had also to have reflected on the Jannie Biddulphs, the Alan O'Briens, the Liam Websters, the Craig McBrides, the Paul Hewitt Phippses, and the Keith Mansfields. The list would be endless. These are all individuals who in their own way have made a difference in the lives of boys who've passed through this school. In this respect, there is, in my opinion, no one master or no one school teacher who stands out as more important than the other. I mentioned at the start of this address that I'm not a constitutional judge, I'm not a national sports captain or a renowned entrepreneur. I'm of the opinion that these people did not arrive at this school as ordinary boys. PBHS certainly helped them along the way and pointed them in the right direction. But something inside of me tells me that these individuals and many more successful individuals like them would have been successful anyway. This evening, I believe that we are celebrating the unwritten success of every schoolmaster, every teacher, and every old boy who's passed through this school in the past 100 years. I believe that the success of this school continues to revolve around the success of the common man more than it does around the success of the outstanding individual. For me, the success of this school is about those boys who flick peanuts. It's about those boys who do immature things with banana in their mouths. It's about those boys who arrive here without manners. It's about those boys who do not necessarily have a sound set of values. This school is about those boys who leave as far better individuals than those who arrived. So for me, the value of this school is not so much in excellent individuals that it has produced, but rather the countless number of lives that it's molded and changed. This evening I've told you my story. Each and every one of you will have your own story, and for me that is what counts. To each and every one of you, this school means something. Your particular success or any other old boy's particular success does not count. The difference this school has made in your life, the difference this school has made in the lives of boys who've passed through its gates for the past 100 years, and the difference it will continue to make in the lives of boys who continue to pass through its gate in the next 100 years, is what counts. What counts is the fact that this school has the ability to take ordinary boys like you and me and turn them into extraordinary people that we would otherwise never have been. Gentlemen, I ask you to charge your glasses with me, please. This evening we drink, and I propose a toast to Pretoria Boys High School, 100 years of old boys who've passed through these gates, and the next 100 years of old boys who will pass through these gates. Pretoria Boys High School.